Hello, Tuba Hero here. People often ask me for gear recommendations on which item to use in a build or what to roll to what, and it's really kind of impossible to answer without seeing their overall build. It's something that you could see on D3 Planner if you experimented with the different items or with the different rolls and just see if your damage went up or down. But in a vacuum, when they just ask me, I can't answer because there's so many different categories of damage in this game, and all of them have diminishing returns on themselves. So I made up this chart with a bunch of those categories, and it just kind of showcases how as you stack damage into a category, it actually diminishes. And also, I did a few tabs on the legendary powers and how maybe some people are overvaluing legendary powers. I'm going to start off with elemental damage. Now, this is a separate multiplier, but like any separate multiplier, if you're just adding into that same category, it does diminish in value. It becomes additive in its own category. So, for instance, most builds, you can only get 20 or 40% max elemental damage, and those seem really strong. The first roll gives you 20% total bonus damage, which is huge for one roll, and the second one is about 16.7%, which is bigger than a lot of single rolls. That's why you fight for it on your necklace. You really want 10% crit chance, you really want 100 crit damage, but that 16.7% elemental damage is also right up there as a really, really good roll. When you get past there, however, it keeps going down in value. The first one was 20, the second one was 16.7, 14.3. Everyone's a little bit worse than the one before it. If you already have 200% total elemental damage because you have an additional 5 rolls of 20 or 100% bonus, then adding 20 to your 200 is only adding 1/10 or 10% damage. So at that point, if you have to choose between that or crit chance, you are definitely going to pick 10 crit chance. So here is a line graph showing that your diminishing returns, where over here is your first roll, second roll, third roll, and it just keeps getting lower and lower as you add more to that pile. And there's a little chart off to the side that shows examples in if your damage was 100 billion per attack and you add this many, how much you would be doing per attack by the point you added that much damage. Now on to area damage. Now this category is a little bit different from the other ones because your effect of it is entirely based on how many enemies you have and how spaced out they are. If they are spread out across the screen, it doesn't matter how many you hit with your attack, it's still not benefiting you at all. And if they're clumped together, you get major use out of it. Area damage, if you don't know, 20% of the time that your attacks hit an enemy, it will cause every enemy within 10 yards to take this percentage of damage of that attack. So if you have about 5 or 6 enemies in one spot, basically if you have 50% area damage, you get 50% more damage. If you have 154, you get 154% more damage. But if you have more than 5 or 6 enemies within 10 yards of each other, that just goes up by that amount of enemies more. So if you have twice as many enemies, it'll be twice as much bonus damage. When you're pushing and you're dragging, this basically turns into your elite killer because the trash dies out quick, but the trash is also wounding the elite. And as you kill off the trash in one spot, pull the elite to another spot, kill off the trash in that spot, and the elite is in the middle of all that, that's what actually takes them down. If you just stood there and did your normal damage to the elite, it would just never die. And that is because of the density and your area damage. So I feel when you're non the Rift Guardian and you've got push build with any sort of grouping, or if you just only play mob types where the enemies group themselves, area damage is a lot of bonus damage and should be valued very highly. It basically, to me, is like adding that much damage. I basically see this as an average of at least 50% damage in my push, at least 70% damage in my push. So at least I consider it a 1-to-1, if not more. So anyway, well, as far as the diminishing returns go, it works the same way any other category would work. I guess with the exception that you automatically start with 50% because of Paragon. So it's a weird category in that you never get more than 24 at a time. You get 20 or 24 rolls on your gear, and you come with 50 for free. So that 50 is huge. You should play as though you have 150 plus area damage, even when you only have 50, because that is doing work when you do have a lot of enemies near each other. But when you have low area damage, you can increase your overall amount of area damage by a lot just by adding a roll or two. So for instance, if you went from 50 to 100, you would double it, right? Here I give some percentages of going from 50 to 70 to 90, and then I switch it to 24s because whatever slots I was thinking of, I guess with necklace, this could be 150, and then you could have another, but you almost never want area damage on your necklace. So I got to 130 and then 178 with the two weapons. And this chart shows you that the first one was worth 40%, but really quickly they're worth less than 20% roll. And right here, the reason the line flattens out for a bit is because this is where we switched to doing 24% more per roll. So this gave us 20% more, and it was 18% increase in damage. 20% roll on our gear gave us 18% more area damage proc damage. And this one is a 24% increase in gear, but it still only gave us 18% area damage proc damage. And this one only gives us 16%. So this one we're only getting 2/3 the value. This one we're getting double its value. So the damage quality really diminishes the more of it you stack on. Now, if you pile more enemies on, that'll always increase the efficacy of your area damage. But as far as stacking it on your gear, the first rolls are the most important. All right, the next category, and this is the only one that can scale infinitely, is your main stat, increased by Paragon, by rolls on your gear, or by augments, Caldeson's Despair recipe in the cube. So if you're at 6,000 main stat, Dex, Vitality, or Intelligence, which I've been in the 6,000s for my first push of a season before, at that point, if you were able to just throw on like 100 augs, you would gain a sixth more damage, 16.67%. This is almost enough to jump a Greater Rift here, just from 200 Paragon or to 100 augs. Later on, this is around usually where I am when I'm fully auged, somewhere between 13 to 15,000 main stat. It's only worth 6.67%, or less than half of a GR tier, to gain 1,000 main stat. And people who go past that, 3.33%. So it diminishes pretty hard. But if you're somebody like me early season, or other people in the middle of the season, if you only get to 1,200 Paragon or so, you should actually value rolls of dexterity, vitality even, strength, and intelligence a lot more than the top of the leaderboards would have you believe, because these are actually really large numbers. To get 10% from a roll, or 12.5, that's pretty big. Then I skipped a few tiers, like I was going by 1,000s, I skipped to 15,000, and you can see it fall off, but early game, it's really good. So what I like to do, if I find say, ancient pair of gloves with 1,000-ish main stat of both vitality and the one that does damage, I might use those ancient gloves that can't even be trifecta, let alone quadfecta, early, and then later, after I've gained a ton of main stat and it's starting to lose its efficacy, I might just convert set gloves, if I'm using a 6-piece set, and get non-ancient quadfectas at that point when the main stat doesn't mean so much. But early season, main stat is huge. So moving on to crit chance and crit damage, this one I was kind of surprised by the results after I started plotting out some of the numbers. So for example, I started off really basic. If you're doing 100 damage per attack and your crit damage gives you plus 100%, your chance is 10%, then 9 out of 10 of your attacks are going to hit for 100, and 1 out of 10 attacks are going to hit for 200. You're doing double damage. In that case, you're doing a total of 1100 damage, which is an increase over not critting of 10%. If we switch that to 8 of your attacks are doing 100 and 2 of your attacks are doing 300 total, your total is 1400, an increase of 40%, multiplier of 1.4. So I just kind of did this all the way up to something that I'm guessing is impossible for most builds of 70% crit chance and plus 700% crit damage. I think this would actually be the thing that holds it back, because you could always, have support stuff give you crit chance all the way to heaven, but crit damage, I'm guessing, has a limit lower than this. I'm not certain though. There's a bunch of random items that add it. But anyway, as far as how much your damage increases as you add in both of these, or in every row, it's the same amount. You're always adding 10 crit chance and 100 crit damage. It looks here, and this is what I've looked at in the past, like you always gain more damage. Like it's always better to be adding more. So here you only gain 10%. Here you gain 30. Here you gain 50, and it's just always going up by an odd 10. So 1, 10, 30, 50, 70, 90, 110, 130. It's always going up by that much. And that sounds great. It's always going up by a higher number than it went up last time. Your total damage multiplier, you start off these first 3, you're doing between 1 and 2 times damage. Only for one row, you're doing 2.6, and then 3.5, 4.6, 5.9. Crazy increase. But when I looked at how much you were actually doing more than before, so 10% is 10% more than just doing your normal amount of damage. The next one, which this is still lower than you'll ever see in Diablo, but if you had 20, other than like 1 to 70, if you had 20% and 200%, you've gained 20% damage over this last tier by going from, basically I divided 30 by 110 and got 1.27, or that was 27% of that. So you gain 27% over the last tier, and it keeps increasing for a bit, but here it jumped big by 17%. Here it jumps a ways by 8.7%, and here it only goes up by about 1. So going from 30 and 300 to 40 and 400, this is still basically 4 rolls of gear to gain close to 40% damage. It's good. But after that, it's a little bit less. And then going from 50 and 500 to 60 and 600, it's going down. And the closer you get to max, the less you get out of your crit. So if, for instance, you were critting 90% of the time for 10 times damage, you might understand why just critting 100% of the time for a little bit more damage, at this point, it doesn't really increase your damage over critting 90% of the time for 10 times damage. So maybe that's why it goes down as these numbers go up. But I just thought it was interesting because it starts off increasing by so much, and then it must be somewhere between 30 and 40%. It starts going back down, or maybe between 40 and 50. But anyway, I thought that was interesting. So then I also compared, if you were doing, instead of 50 and 50, what if you did 60 and 40, 60 and 400 in this case? And I compared that number to the 50 and 50. And if you're on, well, it's 10 on each side. So this would be a pretty crazy gap to achieve intentionally. If you have a build that can be 10 to 1, and instead you're 6D to 400, you're gonna feel like you failed. But it's only less than 3% damage difference over the 50 to 500. So I thought that was interesting. If you go crazier with it, 70 to 300, then it's about 12% less damage than it would have been. But comparing that to how much damage you gained overall by having this much crit, only losing 12% for being this freaking far off, it was a smaller loss in damage than I was expecting. So in the future, I'm probably actually going to care less about the 10 to 1 ratio than I have in the past. And over here, I just give some examples. So 30 and 300, those are pretty achievable numbers for anybody. Like, you usually have at least 30 crit chance, even if your build kind of is super lacking it. And if you're like a wizard and lacking in crit damage, you probably still have 300 crit damage. If doing that gives you 100 billion per attack, then these numbers would give you this much attack. So this would be an average of 40 and 400. Would be a 37% increase in your damage to gain 10 and 100. But if you somehow got to these numbers, it would increase it by this much. So here's a set of 3 numbers that will use the same totals of the 10-to-1 ratio, and here's a different set of 3 that uses higher totals. And yeah, those are some numbers that you could get. All right, now on to some legendary powers. I'm going to compare whether you got a perfect roll or something subpar and how much that actually affects your damage. So over here, this is your increase in your damage while you're on your element. So it doesn't matter how many elements you have in your build. When it's up, this is how much your damage goes up. So if you had a 150 roll, if you had a 200 roll, it would increase your damage by 20%. You're going from doing 250% total damage to going 300% total damage. So that's where that number comes from. So actually, if you have one that's in the upper 170s or 180s, you're not really missing out on that much damage. You could be approaching 10 or 11% damage loss. 20% if you got a 150 is quite a bit of improvement. That's over a tier, but anywhere around here, maybe just go for the good primaries rather than worrying about that. The thing is, COE, most builds you don't play with all of your damage coming out while your COE element is up. Over here would be like if you're GOD speed farming or Whirlwind speed farming, and you don't really have any way to make sure you do more damage while your element is up than while it's down. Like, you don't group and then wait until your element and then do all your damage when you're speed farming. So this is overall, if you have 4 elements, how much damage you increase by going from a 150 COE to a 200 COE. And in the case of that example, it's only 9% more damage. If you're going from 180 to 200, you're only gaining less than 4% more damage. So actually, if you're speed farming with the COE, and I've done this in the past myself, I just kind of don't value the legendary power so much. On the opposite end of that would be things like the old Bazooka Wizard or Yuliana's Monk or Tempest Rush Monk, where actually all of your damage is coming while the convention is on its element. But even then, it's not the worst thing in the world to have a 190, because that's only, you only increase your damage by 3.45% from going from 190 to 200, from doing 290% total damage to doing 300% total damage. So don't get too hung up on this. It's rather important when all of your damage comes on your element, but it's pretty close to unimportant when it doesn't. All right, I kind of picked out some common or not so common legendary powers and just went the other way with them. So on the COE, I showed how much damage you would gain from going from whatever roll to the max. Here, I show how much damage you lose if you get a bottom roll, like absolute worst roll you can get. And for all of these items, which some of them have rather large ranges, like 200%, and some of them not so much, it's kind of floating around that 20% mark. So if it's 20% total damage that you can lose for having it be terribly rolled, then having it be in the top half, you're probably not missing out on that much. If you can get great primaries and just at least in the top half on your legendary power, it's probably going to be a good one, even though it might kind of suck to have a 179 like Dead Man's Legacy, thinking, oh, it's not even 180 plus, let alone 190 plus, let alone 200. But really, by that point, you're not losing that much. And this column here is how many percent of legendary power off max equals 1 lost DPS. And so in the Dead Man's Legacy case, if it's 197 instead of 200, you'd lose 1% of damage. If it's 194 instead of 200, you'd lose 2% damage. So every 3 it ticks down, you're only losing another 1% damage. If it's 170, you're losing 10% damage off of if it were max. So on something like Caesar's Memento, which can go all the way up to 800, it's a bracer, so you think, okay, I've got to get this maxed. If I don't get maxed, I might as well just keep gambling bracers because they're cheap and easy to gamble. But even then, you only lose 1% per 9% of roll on it. So if it's, let's just say 45 off, so that would be if it rolled 755, it's kind of in the top quarter. It's not unreasonable to get. You're 5% off of your maximum. So if it's ancient and has all these amazing rolls on it that are highlighted by the fact that it's ancient, you might be okay with losing 5% on your legendary power in that scenario. And that would be, again, if it rolled 755, which sounds really low compared to 800, but it's pretty much fine. Always want to have those primals, but if you don't, it's still not the end of the world. It's just another factor in your overall damage. Now on to some non-separate multipliers or additive multipliers. So this is a bunch of different sources of damage that actually all mysteriously go to the same pool of damage. So while those other ones, like your elements, you are additive within that category, these are things that appear to be different categories that actually add together anyway. So it really helps to be aware of them, because something might seem really good, like the passive momentum, 20% more damage just for moving a lot. But since it's additive, if you already have a bunch of other things in that category, then you're not really gaining 20% damage. So Wudijo did an amazing video covering a whole bunch of additive damage sources and talks in great detail about it. I would suggest watching that. There's a link in the spreadsheet. So I won't go through all of them. I don't think I even know nearly as many as he does or other people in the community. But the basic ones I know are the skill damage on your gear, not the legendary powers, but the 15%. Taeguk is one as well. And there are some passives that add in, as well as some support buffs. So like Z-Barb's Falter, now it's 50% bonus damage, but that's 50% going into the same category as ZDH's 150%, same category as Taeguk, same category. So you've got so much damage in there at this point that you're like, yeah, maybe I don't need 15% on my boots. Maybe it's just fine to go without it. If you know that those are in the same pool, because otherwise it sounds like your skill damage on gear is just a 1.3 times multiplier to get 30%, but if you are aware of these other categories, it's really not. My final note on all of this is that you want to have a lot of all these multipliers, as much as you can get, but you shouldn't sacrifice stacking one category to near the top so that you can get the absolute most out of one. For example, you shouldn't aim for the absolute to be the highest area damage person, if you only have like 40% crit chance and 400% crit damage. You probably would be better off throwing a few of those area damage rolls back into crit. Elemental damage. Now with the SOJ, you can have pretty much any element have some crazy amount of elemental damage on a lawn build, but it's still just adding into that same multiplier pot, and it's really not that much more powerful than it would have been in the past anyway. Your legendary powers, great. You've got this crappy quiver, but it's got max legendary power, therefore it's good, right? Well, no. That the legendary power range is a small part of what makes a quiver good or not. So here I give an example of, let's say, all of these examples I start at 100 billion. Let's say you have 100 billion, 50% Paragon area damage. When it procs, if you have 130%, now that proc is hitting those enemies within 10 yards for 260. If you take that 260 and you were at 0% elemental damage, you add on 40, and now you're doing 364. If you take that 364 and you have COE on when it hits that max that 200% triples your damage. Now you're at 1092. You're already over 10 times as powerful from these separate multipliers. If you were that powerful when you had 10k main stat and you go to 20k, now it's doing 2 trillion. If you were doing all of that 2 trillion damage with 30% crit chance and plus 300% crit damage, and you up that to 50 and 500, now you're doing about double that. And if you are doing that with a low rolled Hunter's Wrath 9th series satchel, then it gets 50% more damage if you jump both of those to their max rolls. This results in one build that's doing 250 billion if it had all these low rolls and a 250% or a 150 COE. You'd be doing 250 billion on your element. The other one would be doing 6.3 trillion. And that's just from raising all of these a bit. So you still had damage in every one of these categories on the worst version of the build. The other one, it's gone up a bit in every category. Let's see, this one doubled. This is 1.4. This one a little more than doubled area damage. These ones didn't even come close to doubling. But all that put together equals 25 times more damage. So yeah, eventually you get to the point where all these things are near max and the only way to raise your damage is Paragon. But early season, Paragon's not the reason that somebody's doing 25 times more damage than you. It's the combo, the spread of separate multipliers. Always go for as much as you can across the board. Don't just go like, I need my elemental to be maxed. I need my legendary power to be maxed. I need to have as many area damage rolls as I can. Spread it out. It's almost always better. So you made it all the way to the end, huh? Or maybe you just skipped here. Either way, I'm going to send you out with some slide whistle.